Hello, everyone. I hope you had as good an Easter as I had. Our Good Friday service was strangely beautiful, solemn, and serious, and I don't remember another quite like it. Maybe some good things are happening in our world. I hope so. For those of you who are first-timers here, I hope there are some. My name is John Patrick. I'm a retired professor. I have taught, I was primarily a researcher for most of my career, but I did internal medicine at the beginning and pediatrics on the way through and at the end. I also taught courses in the history of science and did a lot of lectures on ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. Those were all sort of forced on me by students, and at some point I may tell that story. But the other thing I do each week is to, at the request of several people, to go slowly through the Sermon on the Mount, which has been central to my own life and to what I now see has been one of the more beautiful things I've been allowed to do, because during my lifetime, one of the most striking things that happened is the reduction in the number of books that people are reading, especially children, actually. Before screens and the like were invented, I was consuming books as a child at an incredible rate, as I now realize. Several a week sometimes, because I grew up in a working class environment, and so I didn't have any homework or any pressures to succeed. I went to school, listened to what was said, did the exercises that we were given. There was no homework. I could remember what had been done the day before. That was no problem. So my reading was the rest of the day, so to speak. Plus one other thing, which used to be a major feature both for my wife and myself. We can both remember running home from school in order to be sure that we were home by 5 o'clock. And that wasn't for our mum. That was for the BBC Children's Hour, which was a superb program. It didn't have any agenda except to engage children. And so you had superb actors reading stories for an hour, sometimes serialized, sometimes others. I can still remember some of those characters. But it gave us a taste for how the mere words on a page could come to life when somebody really knew how to read. And we learnt to do that by imitation, not at that level, of course, although at our stage we bring to it something which actors have to feign, and that is a genuine commitment to what we're talking about. I mean, the wonder of great artists is that in the acting profession is they can make you feel they're a saint one day and the worst of criminals the next. That's pure art. We know nothing about their characters except what comes out later. So this Easter, after the Sunday morning service, which was good, but not as good as Good Friday, I went for lunch with my son and his family, and then to supper with one of my daughters, when there was, 20 or so people there. So I had a lovely day of conversation. Since my wife is in England for the month of April, or most of it, visiting her sister and stepmother and friends and the like, which I declined to join. I hate flying now, but I do it for sheer necessity. Although I'm looking forward to a trip in the beginning of May in his image program for medical residency in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then visiting my good friend and his wife, Wayne and Gina Detmer, who have been running the oldest clinic for the indigent and poor in North America for a long while, and they have done an incredible job. Who can imagine a mission field more difficult than South Side, Chicago, which is where the Lawndale Clinic is? But they have redeemed whole chunks of it, and they provide medical services to, I think it's 60,000 people a year. I mean, if you're looking for something to support in these days where things with real foundations seem so infrequent, here's one to put on your list. Just put Lawndale Health System, Southside Chicago, and you'll find it. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, what am I going to talk about today? Well, first of all, the bit from the Sermon on the Mount, which does tie in with other things I want to talk about today. One of the pleasures of doing bit by bit, I don't have to be chronological. And I want to go to the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7. And it has one of the most difficult verses in the Sermon on the Mount, also one that challenges. Jesus says that we make choices. Now remember, the Sermon on the Mount, if you're not a Christian, you're only looking at it from the outside. If you're a Christian, you're looking at it from the inside. You know that you are called to be a disciple. You may have had an amazing conversion, but that is still only the introduction to the faith. And Jesus began his ministry on earth by talking about what would make a really satisfactory life, a life that leads inevitably to its continuation in eternity. So in going through, he lays out the basic structure, which I hope those of you who listen to this podcast regularly are beginning to make a daily habit at some stage during every 24 hours. I really recommend that you quietly say to yourself the Beatitudes and ask yourself how you're performing in each case, and then move on inevitably to repentance, because we may be redeemed, but we're still fallen. So what John Stott says is the summary of the Sermon on the Mount is you must be different. So in this last chapter, Jesus talks about the fact that we choose how we live our lives. And he says, you can go down the broad way or the narrow way. The problem is the broad way, which most take, according to Christ at that level, doesn't lead to the most satisfactory life. It leads to loss at some level. I don't think it means the loss of your soul if you've once given it to Christ, but it means you've made some poor choices. We all do at some stage or another. And he says there's a narrow way, and that leads to life. Now, the point about the narrow way, of course, is you can't take anything with you. No baggage allowed, so to speak, like a modern flight. The broad way, you take whatever you want. You do what you want most of the time. But the way of discipleship is the narrow way, and that, says Jesus, leads to life. A little later, he makes it even more difficult in a way. He says, at Judgment Day, there will be some people who come and say, but Lord, we cast out demons in your name. We raised the dead. We did this and that in your name. And he said, I will say to them, depart from me. I never knew you. That is very frightening. But then he comes to the end with a parable. And the parable is one that, how can I say this kind? I think we misuse it most of the time. It can be used as a straightforward means of saying, look, we're all fallen sinners, come to Christ and you build on the rock, etc. But that's not what it is being used for in the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's a perfectly reasonable illustration, but what Jesus says is this: what shall I compare the man who says that he is listening to my words and he is starting to obey them? This is the difference. Both the man who builds on the rock and the man who builds on the sand hear the words of Christ. I would say, understand them. The difference between the two is not salvation and hell. It's between having a life that is solid and grounded or one that is not, built on sand. The difference between the two is not what they know, but whether they are obedient. And that is really frightening, isn't it? not in a bad way, because, as I pointed out many times, and we'll go on doing so, what that does is send you back to the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, to work your way through the Beatitudes, to see how you correct that. You haven't got the right poverty of spirit to begin with. You don't realize how dangerous life is, perhaps, and so you need to get that straight. I don't know where the turning point for you would be, but that there is one, I do know. You just got to search until you find it. And the searching plays into your character and makes you useful to others later on. Nothing is wasted by God. So, with that said, what's our culture as a whole doing? Well, you've had an election in the States not so long ago, and we're having one at the end of this month in Canada. I guess the countries that I know best, like Burundi and DRC, have not had a proper election in their lifetimes. I hope they'll come, but it takes time. One of the big problems that we'll come to in a moment is that level. South Africa, a beautiful country that we first went to in '87, and we've been there many, many times and have many friends there, and across the spectrum. And they're having a fearful time because their government is corrupt, even more corrupt than those in the West. In the West, we live on the declining ruins of a system that worked for us. And the question is whether it can be redeemed or not. And I'm not sure about that. I don't know what's going to happen. But it's been striking in our case in Canada that this election has not paid any real attention to the big questions of life. Where do I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Death, suffering, etc. Which in our case, in the Western world, whether we like it or not, and many of us like it not, we are the product of Jewish and Christian thought with a considerable input at the base from Greek thought and a very, very small input from Islam around the 10th, 11th centuries. That input largely centered around the fact that they preserved Greek when the church split. Greek went east and Latin went west. If an alien had come from Mars and looked at Europe around the 10th century, it would have thought, well, Western Europe's going nowhere. They're always fighting one another in small fiefdoms. Probably wouldn't even notice that the one thing they did have in common is that they did bend the knee to the Pope. They feared for their souls at one level, although the world at large was brutal. I'm actually reading Barbara Tuchman's book at the moment, and she's a historian, and she's writing about those Middle Ages, which were dark and not so dark, depending on which way you look at it. So they were God-fearing, strangely, but they thought they could appease God by fighting and getting the winnings, and then they'd pay for a monastery or something of the sort. But it was out of that background, in due course, that something very different emerged. And over my lifetime, really, it has been disappearing steadily. Can you imagine that moment in Churchill? He'd just taken power, and he knew what a hard time was coming, and he needed support. So he snuck away from his security and went out into London and got on the underground, the tube, as we called it. And, of course, people recognized him, and he started talking to them about whether they were up for fighting with the Germans. And without exception, these ordinary people comforted him and encouraged him, because the answer was a solid yes. And that was very real, because it was rooted in a system of education which we then, after the war, set about destroying, largely because of clever people who thought they knew about education, whereas what they only knew was how to destroy it. Let me put in a common aside at this point for those of you who haven't heard it before, but it's one that you can put in. If you haven't read any Wendel Berry, read the first of the Port William novels, Watch With Me, and the heroine is a village school teacher in the days of horse and buggy. And Wendel Berry describes her thus. He says, Miss Minnie went to Teachers' College, where she learnt many cunning techniques, which she never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children and she loved books. And she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. Education is not something that you can learn in university. To be an educator is a gift, and it combines two loves, and you can't teach love. You can only watch it and have it flow over you. She loved children, and she loved books. It's a beautiful story. You will love it. But that phrase is worth building into your standard armamentarium, if you like, of when you heard something said well, first write it down, memorize it, know where it comes from, and then drop it into conversations when you see an opportunity. I mean, smart people say, where did you get that from? And then it opens up for a discussion. But proper words in proper places, as I've got Name Block, the author of 1984, called the proper description of style, George Orwell. Improve your language by having better metaphors, better things well said. Unto whom all hearts are open, from whom no secrets are hid. Those are phrases that are worth having in your mind. That they come back to at the end of life. What's going to be the literature, the phrases, the books that will comfort you on your deathbed? Those sorts of phrases do. It's a changing world, and we are in trouble. So what happened? Well, of course, up until, in fact, it took some time after the war. My wife and I got into the late 50s before we went to university, and up until the 60s, in schools in England, the Bible was read every morning in school. Not some repeated phrase or a national anthem. We sang the national anthem very rarely, but real literature, because the Bible is the basis of Western literature, was read to us at a time of peak capacity to remember. And that provides foundation for so much learning and living. And then it was taken out in the 60s, completely in your world, where the secularists managed to persuade you that religion was not good enough and secularity was better. But secularism that attacks Christianity, which it's doing increasingly, is itself a faith. The people who propose this believe that it is the best way to run and train children. But they don't look at the evidence. They don't use Tom Sowell's rules and say, okay, let's look at where they've done it, where they haven't. Let's look at the results. Do we have any data? Of course, we have lots of data now. The world was a very, very different place when children ran home to listen to great actors reading good stories. Can't imagine that now. So this is showing up in our election big time. It's showing up by its absence. There's been no discussion that I've come across about character, although character matters. In Britain, at least, they have at long last started saying the Pakistani rape gangs, the multiculturalists have lost that round. And of course, once you start looking at it and thinking about it, the culture that runs from Morocco to Afghanistan all along an east-west line is a culture in which women are used by men. And when they took slaves, they could do what they liked with them. And they did take slaves. Far more slaves went from Europe into Africa at the hands of Muslim pirates and traders that went across the Atlantic. Slavery obviously had appeared in the Jewish Hebrew community by the time of the exit from Egypt, because they were slaves in Egypt. And in the Torah, there are rules on how slaves and masters are to interact. So it's part of fallen human nature and has been forever. We exploit one another. And it's absolutely stupid to imagine that only the black slavery in America was the only thing that happened. Not true. More black slaves went to east than ever went west. The only difference was the Muslims didn't want them around in their genes, so they castrated them all before they took them into service. Try telling that to the modern oversexed black youth, but it's the truth. So in our election, the discussions are not about character, except insofar as there have been attacks on Carney because he set up and has made his career out of pushing greening politics, ESG and that sort of thing. But he put the money, lots of money, into the companies that he set up, not in Canada, but in an offshore haven to avoid paying tax in Canada. And he's sort of trying to deny that, but it looks obvious that that's what he did. But it doesn't look as though it's going to stop him getting elected at the moment, which is sad because we know what he's going to do. He says he's not going to do it. He's going to cut the carbon tax because he must know that all the science is coming in and showing that it's rubbish. The best recent video I've seen is by John Robson, a colleague who is the face of Climate Discussion Nexus, CDN. It's easy to be green was one of the last ones, because, of course, the one thing that has happened with the very, very small increase in CO2 levels from one of the lowest in the whole of history, which they use as the reference point at the end of the 19th century. You go back 50 million years and it's way higher. So there has been a small increase over the last little while. There's no evidence that it's made a major difference to temperature, but it has increased the proportion of the Earth's surface that goes green every year by the size of Australia. It's easy to go green, is John's argument, and it's worth watching. I'm surprised this hasn't been brought up in the elections. It should have been, but such is life. Your election, of course, in the States, we always live next door to you, so we necessarily take great interest in you. It is fascinating to watch. I'm not sure how I would make my mind up in the long run, but what it does seem to have done very effectively is demonstrate what ordinary people assumed was true for a long while. There's an awful lot of corruption there. The Brits are finding out the same thing. Maybe with all our modern technology, we should be able to have a closer look at how rich politicians are becoming and where the money comes from. You don't know many politicians who rise to the top who go away other than extremely rich. So something needs sorting out. And obviously, they're uncovering that at an incredible rate. That can only be good at one level. But the way in which the economy is being run certainly doesn't appeal to Canadians at the moment. But it's the art of the deal for Trump, isn't it? So he'll back down when the time comes, I'm sure. But in Britain, at least, there's a very rapidly increasing recognition that Muslims are not good citizens. And we ought to know that. And so the next thing I want to talk about is, how do we think about Islam? One ought to pay attention to what they themselves say. And how do we think about our own culture? And I want to read to you two quotations. One from Jürgen Habermas, who was an honest atheist as far as I can as far as I know, but a philosopher. And the other from Osama bin Laden, whose name you know. But first Habermas. He says, for the normative self-understanding of modernity, Christianity has served as more than just a precursor or a catalyst. Universalistic egalitarianism, from which spring the ideals of freedom and a collective life in solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights, democracy, is a direct legacy, the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. That's the opposition, so to speak, recognizing the truth of it. He actually ended up writing a book with Pope Benedict at one point. I haven't read it. Now, what did bin Laden say? Well, this is what he said. We renounce you. Enmity and hate shall forever reign between us, till you believe in Allah alone. Allah's word to his prophet was, O prophet, wage war on the infidels and the hypocrites, and be ruthless. Their abode is hell, an evil fate. Such is the foundation of the relationship between the infidel and the Muslim. Battle, animosity, and hatred directed from the Muslim to the infidel, and we consider this justice and kindness to them. That jihad has been part of Islam from the beginning, and it meant war. In fact, the Muslim divides the world into Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb is the region of war, and Dar al-Islam is the region of peace. That's the way they see it. They're not really nationalists at all. It's a sort of pseudo-concept for them. Those are the concepts they really care about. Now, I hope this comes up on the screen, but in the right way around, but no doubt if it doesn't, we'll do something about it. But it's called The Decline of Eastern Christianity Under Islam, From Jihad to Dimitude. And it's by an amazing woman, Batye Or. I've had this book for, don't know whether I put the date at the beginning. No, I didn't. But it was first published in French and then translated into English in 1996. It was published in 1991 in Paris. French-speaking, amazing woman who is very careful about the history of what goes on, what went on, and how it happened. And the book I've just shown you is her second book. And she'd written one before on dimitude, which is a phrase you may not have heard of, but Muslims know it, because if you were a person of the book, a Christian or a Zoroastrian, probably a Hindu or a Jew, you were not given the choice which the infidels, the pagans, were given. In war, what you did with your prisoners, if they weren't from the ancient religions, you said, you can convert to Islam now, or I will cut your head off. And that's what they did. As you can imagine, most people converted. But obviously it wasn't in their heart. It was a matter of prudence at one level anyway. So, but what happened to the people of the book wasn't that they had a wonderful multicultural society. They didn't. They had to recognize their inferiority. They had to wear signs of that inferiority. They had to pay more taxes, a lot more taxes. The tax rate on them was so high that they had to sell every fourth child, male, into slavery. And they were recruited to be turned into the most vicious fighters in the Islamic world, because the sheikh needed his immediate bodyguard, which was grown out of these boys, to be on his side. And they were on his side because if they fell, they would be dead. It was dangerous to lead in the Muslim world an awful lot of their rulers were murdered. Many were murdered in the West too, but nowhere near the rate that leadership in the early Islamic world turned out. Death was the more frequent outcome. So it wasn't all joy and peace. Islam is not the religion of peace. Hershey Ali is making this very clear, but it was clear long before the modern period. Jihad, which some of the more sophisticated Muslims in the Western world try to pretend that it's just you battling with your own soul. We all battle with our own souls. We all know what good and evil are, and we all fail to do the good and do the evil with rather monotonous regularity. Jesus told us it's going to be like this. The solutions are not in this world in that sense. He said, in this world you will have struggle, you will have war, the poor will always be with you, but I will also be with you. The solutions come later, but the experience of them can begin now. So that book is worth having and reading carefully. Christianity declined under Islam. There's no question about that. The intent is not just to win battles, but to turn the world into an Islamic world. And that's what people are beginning to realize in Britain, that they have no intention of becoming British. They live in increasingly ghettoized areas. Where the city that I grew up on the edge of, Birmingham, is now, in effect, the largest Muslim-run city in the Western world, and it's totally bankrupt. They're utterly incompetent. It looks as though the government may have to take over the running of the city, which would be very interesting. It's interesting, those of you who are Tolkien fans, where Tolkien was born, or not born, where he grew up for part of his life was in Moseley. It's right on the edge of that area. The change in that city in my lifetime is beyond belief. But the ones that are bothering are the Islamists, and they're not out of line. Osama bin Laden was not out of line. He was drawing on a long history of war. And it dies down, but you've just seen in the very recent past a whole bunch of Muslim scholars have said it is the duty of all serious Muslims to engage and to support the war against the West. They're just being honest about the way they have understood the Quran and the Hadiths over the centuries. They're not being dishonest. They're being honest about what has been the general opinion. There are times when they have to back down, and the Quran even tells them how to do it. If you make a treaty, you only keep it as long as it suits you, and then you break it. I mean, they did get to the gates of Vienna less than 300 years ago. And if they'd won that battle, we'd probably be Muslims. By the grace of God, I think we're not. And it's astonishing, isn't it, that they want to come and live with us. Now, two sorts of Muslims are moving. Some come for purely economic reasons, and they grudgingly admit that. Some come because it's their intention to force Sharia law on the rest of us. Now, in Britain, there's real rage boiling up over this, and it looks like it's going to bring the Labour government down to me, and we'll see what happens then. Because the multiculturalists are stupid. They don't even see that multiculturalism is a contradiction a multicultural society is a contradiction in terms. Because the whole point about what's going on at the moment is not that cultures are going to live peaceably together. Not if Muslims are involved. They want to control. At which point it will no longer be multicultural. It will be Islamic. Multiculturalism, as a society, you bring in several competing ways of understanding the most important questions about human life. That's not going to be a recipe for making your society stronger. It's going to be a recipe for destroying it. which is what it's done. I mean, you can never have a multicultural medicine. You could have doctors from different cultures, and they should be as numbers warrant, so to speak. But they're going to do it differently. If you believe that life has no ultimate meaning, you do life differently. Our problem is that the long march to the universities has got to the so-called intellectual elite who are not intellectual very much, especially in the professions, being ruled by people who are frankly antagonistic to Christianity without recognizing that it gave them, as Habermas pointed out, the goods of the society which allows them to have these lovely professions to work in. The law in Canada has been taken over by people who are opposed to Christianity on the whole. It's certainly the law is not populated by a cross-section of belief systems that operate in Canada. Neither is the university. So we're watching this work itself out. And the good news to me is it seems that, as in the States, ordinary people, despite the obvious character flaws of Trump, understood that he did have some concern for them, real concern. And they reward him with loyalty and enthusiasm. I happened to be in the States after his first election victory some years back, and I happened to be giving an after-dinner speech in Philadelphia, and sitting next to me was a politician, and I said to him, "Were you surprised by the election result?" He said, "No, we knew it was going to happen," because Trump had wisely realized that the people he needed to go after were people who hadn't voted in the last 3 elections. It's a considerable number of people, enough to turn the election in his favor. And it was a pretty close run. But so they put all their money not into making a lot of noise in public, but getting on the phone to people who had not voted in 3 elections and being persistent and saying, "Look, this is your chance. You don't think politics can do you any good. We think it can. Give it a try." And they turned out in sufficient numbers to win. That was very smart politics. So that meant that I understood that this man was not stupid in any way. Conrad Black has had interactions with him, and he says, and Jordan Peterson as well, they say he's highly intelligent. Now, of course, he's also not someone you would want to take out your daughter, certainly in earlier years. But he's intelligent, he's smart. He doesn't want to wreck the country, so I presume it's his art of the deal thing that he's doing at the moment. He certainly wants to make sure that China bends the knee, and of course China's doing everything it can to say it won't do that, but now the numbers are coming out. They've grossly inflated the size of their population. They've grossly inflated the success of their economy, and it's falling apart. Whether it's going to survive, I don't know. But that's the world we live in.